Well, thanks very much for joining us, and thank you, TrainSmart, for having me. What a privilege. David Bunney is my name, and I'm the author of Success Leaves a Trail, which has gone Amazon bestseller. Look, I am really excited about this webinar today because out of all the topics that we've done before, this one is the one that you're probably going to use the most. You know, we are persuaded and influenced every single day, whether it be at work or at home. You can't get away from it, and the advertisers know that as well. But let me give you some warning. We're going to go fairly deep in four main areas of influence and persuasion. So I highly recommend you have a notepad and pen to take some notes, but don't get too complicated with it. I promise at the very end, I'm going to give you a 3-step formula for applying everything we covered today. And in fact, even if you just apply the first step, you'll be miles ahead of most other people that don't even understand this. So lean forward, get excited, and let's get into it. So we're going to get started by having a look at who actually has influence and how that actually affects us from day to day. Where do we get influence from? Well, I guess it starts from our parents. And then even through school, some of your teachers probably end up having some influence on you, which changes your behavior. And we said in some of the earlier webinars that your behavior is a reflection of your beliefs and values. And of course, they come from your environment, you know, what you're exposed to, the people that have direct impact on, on your thinking. So it's important to understand this because there'll be times when you need to filter out some of the information that is not serving you very well at all. You know, if you spend too much time looking at negative media in the press, you know, you might turn into a very sad, negative person, you know, opposed to listening to some uplifting music. So if you understand the impact it actually has on you, it'll help you prepare you to filter out what's important and what's not. And of course, if you have a look at some of the seasoned thought leaders in the world, you know, here's some examples here of Murdoch or Dick Smith, you know, Barack Obama, Oprah Winfrey. You know, when you have so much influence and power, so too is a responsibility to use that correctly. You know, we've seen cases in the world where you use it for good or evil. But they've been around for some time and they've got a lot of experience. What about somebody new? You know, in the Time magazine's top 100, Taylor Swift has just been included in that list this year. And she's got 153 million followers on her social media. That's a lot. And she's only 25 years old. You know, so that's a huge responsibility. So I guess the outcome here is to choose wisely the type of influence that you'll allow to have an impact on you. So how good are we at the moment of influencing? Well, what are some of the things that we try when we're trying to get our own way? You know, do we ask nicely, reason, make demands, try and charm our way through, shout, cry, you know, charisma, that works sometimes, beg, emotional blackmail, bully our way through. You know, we try all these things and guess what? They really often just simply don't work, do they? So it's fairly apparent we're going to have to understand exactly what does work because we already know what doesn't work all that effectively. Before we can move on, I need to illustrate a point here. Here is a drill bit. You've probably seen them before, you might even own a couple. But it's not just any drill bit. This particular one is a high tensile steel. It's gold anodized, shiny, new, one of a kind. In fact, I've only got one today. And I'm ready to sell it here for $47. Now, who wants it? Okay, I can see by the response of 0. Why? Well, as you probably already know, what am I really selling? This beautiful precision instrument? No, I'm not. I'm selling the ability to drill a hole. Now, if you don't want any holes at the moment, you might be doing some renovation, you probably don't need to buy this drill bit. And that's the point I make. So just stay with me, it'll all be clear. When you get on to influence persuasion, we're about to go on a webinar and we're saying, how do I do it? Give me all the information. I need to know how to influence people or persuade people. Well, is that really what you need? You know, let's have a look at the definition. The definition of it is to act, causing people to do or believe, or causing people to think in a particular way. So just think about that definition in itself. Do you need all this information? What are we trying to achieve here? Let's think back to the drill. The drill produced the ability to drill a hole. Well, if you had the how-to information of influence persuasion, what we're really trying to achieve here is to influence somebody's decision. Now think about that carefully. We're trying to create a decision or have an impact on a decision. Now, if you don't have the use to change somebody's decision or make them think in a particular way, then you don't need all this information about influence and persuasion. That is a critical part of this webinar, so I really hope that you sort of get your mind around that. Let's have a look at some fun facts before we move on. The first thing is manipulation. Now, I know we talk about influence and persuasion and manipulation, but manipulation, the actual definition of that is selfish. You do things for a very selfish reason. And usually that's not so good. It's really not a good one to concentrate on. I know 3-year-olds, if they want an ice cream or something, they might throw a tantrum in the middle of a shopping centre. It's very I don't know, they must be born with this talent to get parents to do what they want. But that's manipulation. It's all about self. Try not to concentrate on that. We don't want that. The definition of influence is anything that actually is non-verbal, right? Now I know we're talking semantics here, dictionary meanings and that, but it's actually non-verbal. So if I wanted to influence you to put a jacket on or something, I might make the air conditioner colder or something. That would be a non-verbal. Or made you happy, I'd put posters around the wall, of happiness. That would be non-verbal examples of having an influence. And of course, persuasion is the opposite. It's the verbal side of things. Anything you say can be a persuasive argument with things. So that's verbal. So that's really, non-verbal is influence, verbal is persuasion. And the last word you come across occasionally is rhetoric. And this stems back into the Greek days, which we'll be having a look at a little bit later. The art of speaking and writing effectively. Rhetoric, sometimes it sort of embellishes or highlights some facts that may not even be true. It makes a point out of them. So it's rhetoric. So just think about that. Influence is non-verbal, persuasion usually is verbal, rhetoric is a bit of a combination of both. Okay, so to understand the decision-making process, remember that's what we were talking about before. We needed to influence people to make a decision. Well, we need to know how our brain works. Not our single brain, our 3 brains. And a lot of people don't understand this or don't know that we actually have 3 brains. Probably because of shows on television like CSI and that, or some of the medical shows, they throw this grey lump on the table and they dissect it or something. It looks like a human brain, but we actually have 3 brains. We'll get into it a little bit later in the next slide. Okay, so this is an important slide, this one. Our 3 brains made up of the reptilian or the primitive brain. The one in the middle is the limbic, and that also has a little text called the amygdala, which handles our emotions. And of course the large one, the neocortex or the human brain. It's important to understand these because the reptilian, we'll start at the bottom, the reptilian or the primitive brain takes care of our breathing, our heart rate, compulsive behavior. You never have to think about, oh, I've got to blink my eyes right now, or I need to take a breath. They're just automatic responses. They're, compulsive behavior. The one in the middle, the limbic brain, handles our emotions. And this is very, very important. The emotions or memories of emotions, gut feeling. Someone talks about, I understand the logic, but I have this gut feeling. Well, this gut feeling is actually memories of emotions or your values and your judgments. It comes from the middle bit. And the interesting thing is that 95% of decisions are actually made as a combination of these bottom two, the limbic and the reptilian brain, which is amazing. Because after you make that decision, and it can be milliseconds before it even talks to the neocortex, that the neocortex then rationalizes that decision with some logic. And so our decision-making process starts with the emotions first, and then it's rationalized with a little bit of logic a little bit later. This is an incredibly important part to get your head around, to understand, because once we understand how to change your decision-making process, we know that decisions are actually part of emotionally driven. So that'll lead us on to where we're heading next. So in this illustration, it talks about the amygdala that I mentioned earlier as part of your limbic brain. It also handles things like stress and other emotions. But it shows here that your sensory input, which comes from our 5 senses, we're going to talk about that a little bit later, very often takes a shortcut. And so your senses come in, go straight across to the amygdala in the limbic brain, and then your emotional driven response is a result. Now occasionally, I say occasionally, sometimes it goes right up the top into the cortex. We call this the high road, which is conscious thought. But most of the time, your decisions really come from your emotions, which is from your sensory input. I know this is very deep. We don't have to go any deeper, but I guess the single learning outcome of what I'm illustrating here is simply decisions are emotionally driven. That's all you really need to look at. And so if they are emotionally driven, let's have a look at some of these emotions. On the left-hand side, we've got natural emotions. And these are ones, well, they're natural. Joy, love, anger, sadness, fear, disgust, or sometimes contempt. That's what they call natural emotions. Now, from those natural emotions, a lot of the marketing companies and the advertising have their own set of emotions that they call call to action. These are the 5 key emotions that they target in almost all advertising and marketing because they're the most powerful. And they are love, fear, pride, guilt, and greed. And they use these in advertising all the time. In fact, fear is one of the very strong ones. They use fear marketing campaigns all the time, particularly if they bring in pain in there as well. In fact, just as a side note, the fear of pain is stronger than the promise of pleasure. Now, marketers know that, and they base their whole campaigns on the fear of pain, rather than say, "Oh, buy my product, and it's going to make you feel wonderful." They say, "If you don't buy my product, this is what you're going to suffer." So yeah, it gets fairly deep. Okay. So moving on, decisions are made from emotions. We know that. So I'm going to try and illustrate the building of a persuasive argument, or the building of persuasion. That's what we're talking about here. And we said before, the total outcome is simply to have influence on a decision. Right? Now, if we're in the woodworking business or construction, we need to make decisions on a solid foundation. And so here's our workbench. And we're going to call the workbench is going to be founded on some Greek philosophy. We're going to talk a little bit later on about the Greeks. It's been around 2,500 years. It still is relevant today. So if you're going to influence a decision, just imagine it being the whole persuasive argument has got to be based on a solid foundation, just like a workbench. And on that workbench, we're going to have some materials. Now in this case, we're going to liken the materials to some of our natural senses. And the last piece of the woodworking construction is the 6 tools from Robert Cialdini, and we'll talk about them. So that's how we're going to build this persuasive argument. It's going to be built in 4 sections. The decision, the outcome, based on a solid foundation, using some materials, and choosing some of the tools. So let's move on. Step number 1. Well, step number 1 is, if our decisions are emotionally driven, we need to know which of these emotions would serve us the best. Say if you were, trying to get your own way. Say we were doing an advertising campaign. Which of these emotions would serve us the best in a campaign? Could it be some of our natural ones, the joy or the love? Or could it be some of the call to action emotional ones, the guilt and the greed? You see a lot of charities and that, they have guilt as part of, save the whatever. Usually will have a guilt undertone to it. Greed might be in the real estate industry sometimes, where they talk about the property values going up, or it could be as simple as those shoes you need to buy and they're 75% off the retail price. That is an underlying emotion there of greed. So step number 1 of building our whole argument is, let's have a look at which emotions are going to serve us the best. So step number 2, we then have a look at some of our senses. And I guess if we were mechanically trying to build this persuasion, you would then choose which senses would also have the best impact. The first sense of sight. So what could you do visually that would have an influence or persuasion over somebody on a visual side of things? The second sense, of course, is a hearing. You see some of the movies, they have a tremendous soundtrack on behind because they're advertising them, because they know that the sound can actually have an influence on your emotions, how you feel. We all know that. You listen to some happy music, makes you feel good, doesn't it? Of course it does. The next one, of course, is taste. The sweetness is something that they, the lolly shops, all hinge everything on taste. How does it taste? The next one is touch. A lot of the advertising talk about how nice it'll be to have that feeling. And of course the last one is smell. And you don't have to be in the perfume industry to use smell as an influence. So your 5 senses are critical to having an influence on your emotions, which then, as we said, determine some of your decision-making process. So that's the 5 senses. All right, how are we? Hanging in there? Taking lots of notes? I hope so. So let's move on. Step number 3 goes back to the Greek philosophers 2,500 years ago. Aristotle in particular, but he also, lent very heavily on Plato. In fact, he went to Plato University. Very, very interesting. If you want to, learn some more, just do a search on the Greek philosophers. You can really learn a lot from there. But Aristotle is the one that we're going to concentrate on. And he said that the key to persuasion was rhetoric. And in those days, they really sort of highlighted some of the speeches and the writing, some of the points they make. But anyway, Aristotle came up with 3 steps of rhetoric, and these are still relevant today. They are still used in just about all Western philosophy, and it's a 3-step process. Let's have a look at them. The first step is what they call ethos. Now, ethos, Greek for ethics, but we talk about character, somebody's character. Their reputation or their status in the community will have a huge impact. Morals or the the tenor, how long you've been in a job perhaps, or the respect. But everything is grounded in Aristotle's steps is in the character or the reputation as a grounding. And this is really important to get done first before he moves on to the next two. So ethos. Now the next one is pathos. Pathos actually is Greek for pathetic, but we're talking about the emotions here. He says that you really need to awaken the emotions. They were the words he uses. Awaken the emotions. And of course we get empathy and suffering out of pathos, but we're talking about emotions, right? Pathos. So we start off with a foundation of ethos, reputation, character, and then he said overlays that with pathos, the emotions or the awakening of the emotions. And the last one is logos. Now logos is Greek for reason, and we get logic out of logos. Logical, arguments of reason. What he's saying there is it's very, very difficult to refute an argument of reason that's based on logic. And that's why he includes it in his 3 steps. But don't forget, they're actually in order, that if our decision making is made more on emotions, it's really important to get them awakened first before you try and bring into some logic or an argument of reason into the equation. So that's his 3 steps. 2,500 years, they're still being used today. And that's back to our workbench. That's our solid foundation of ethos, character, pathos, emotions, logos, logic. Now step 4, this is the last bit of building our persuasion construction. Step 4 comes from Robert Cialdini, and he has 6 principles. He wrote this book in 1984. He did a research on all the different persuasion and the influence, and he condensed it down into just 6 areas. And this book is used today, or there's 6 areas of steps are used today, and I call them the tools in our construction. So let's take a look at what they are. He talks about the power of influence in 6 principles: reciprocity, consistency, social proof, liking, authority, and scarcity. They're the 6 principles that he's condensed it down into. And we're going to go through them one at a time because they're really useful tools to have in the toolbox. You know, some large corporations, and we'll use some case studies a little bit later, but Coca-Cola and Apple, and there's some very large companies, will use all of them in some of their advertising campaigns. Or if you're trying to just influence around, your family or friends or children, clean up your bedroom or something like that, you might just use one of them or 2 of them. So just consider them as being tools, useful tools in a toolbox that you can use one or all of them. That's all you have to consider. So here's one we're all very familiar with: reciprocity. The obligation to give back when you receive. People tend to return a favour. I know, good and bad, but when someone gives us a gift, we sort of have this feeling inside, gee, it's almost like an obligation, I should give something back. Well, that's reciprocity at work. They even use it in restaurants even. They give dinner mints about the same time as the bill comes, try and get a bigger tip. It can be as simple as just paying somebody a compliment. If you get just something good, you have that feeling of giving back. And that's reciprocity. That's that's one of the first principles. The second one is consistency and commitment. Now they sort of go hand in hand. If people make a commitment, they're more likely to honour that commitment right through. And you see this in brand loyalty. Some people talk about a particular brand of motor car and they would not change, or it might be Apple perhaps, but they try and make that commitment or consistency and they stay with it. Congruent with their self-image. Small commitment, then bigger. You know, you see this in advertising. They might, if they can't get you to buy a large amount, then they might reduce it down and say, well, you know, would you just make a small commitment first? And then after you've made that small commitment, they know that it's easier to then get you to make a larger commitment. So they tend to just continue to honour the agreement. So commitment and consistency. People like consistency. Okay, let's move on. Social proof. I believe it when I see it. You've heard that before? You know, people will do what they see other people doing. You know, large crowds, you know, product launches, you see that all the time. Apple is notorious for that. They create artificially a large crowd. So if they see a lot of other people doing it or being involved, then the perception is, well, it must be, it must be good. Believe it when I can see it. After the proof. You can imagine remember back in Roger Bannister, you know, the 4-minute mile. Nobody could run a 4-minute mile. It seemed to be like this psychology of just not able to break through. And of course, eventually he did break through and ran the 4-minute mile. And of course, he only lasted a few days, well, 46 days, I think it was, before someone else was able to do it at the same speed. So after they could see it, then they could do it. Fashion trends, you know, same type of thing. Social proof, a lot of people doing the one thing. And of course, sharing. Now the next principle is liking. We're influenced by people that we like. It's fairly straightforward. There are 3 reasons why we like people. That they're similar to us, and they might also have similar interests. That they pay us compliments, or they show their appreciation and recognition, and they're cooperative and easy to get along with. That's why you make friends with people that you just, you know, that are fun to be around, because they're cooperative and they're fun. But the main one in there is pay compliments, appreciation. We'll come back to that a little bit later. So the application of this particular principle is building rapport, finding common ground first, and that creates liking. Authority. People will tend to obey authoritative figures, real or perceived, I might add. You know, doctors, you always see their credentials on the wall because they're a very authoritative figure. Uniforms, you know, there'll be airline pilots or military or police, authoritative, so they can, you know, persuade people. Dictatorships, now that's for the evil and tyrants, and even celebrity endorsements for some, you know, reason. They also have this air of authority that a celebrity has a fair bit of influence. So as an authoritative figure, they might make a comment on a product. So that's authority, and that's one of the 6 principles. And the last one is scarcity. People want more if it's scarce. And again, sometimes this is real or perceived. You know, short time only offers. You've seen that, limited quantity only, unique, one of a kind. Haven't we seen that all the time? Or in jewelry, you know, rare and precious metals, or rare and precious diamonds and gems. You know, scarcity. It's a very, very powerful principle. So they're the 6 principles: reciprocity, consistency and commitment, social proof, liking, authority, and scarcity. So think of them as a toolbox of tools. You can use one, or you can use more, but they all combine to be part of the equation here. So let's have a look at the decisions then. Decisions are made from emotions. This is wrapping up our whole workbench concept here. So we start off with the decisions are made from emotions, and we went through what they actually were. We said they had to be built, our whole persuasive argument had to be built on a solid foundation, like a workbench. And we said that came from the Greeks, so ethos, pathos and logos, solid foundation. Then we said we had to use some materials, and we said, why don't we use our natural senses of sight, hearing, taste, smell and touch? Because we know that that has an impact on our emotions, which contributes to our decisions. And then we discussed the 6 principles of Cialdini of reciprocity, consistency, social proof, liking and authority. So they're the toolbox. So that's our construction, right? Solid foundation, using some materials, using some of the tools, all together to put into the decision-making process. Now that might be a lot to get your head around, a lot to remember and understand. So let's see if we can give you a simple formula that I promised earlier. And here it is. This 3-step formula is so powerful, people get tripped up on its simplicity. I know we covered all the intricacies of how it all works, but simply, if you want a simple formula, just look at these 3 things. The first thing starts with acknowledgement. Acknowledge people's reality, real or perceived. And it must be done before any attempt of persuasion. You know, they did a test in a recruitment of why people were leaving companies. In this, in this test, they found that 62% of people left their jobs through lack of appreciation, lack of acknowledgement for the work that they have done. People crave acknowledgement and recognition. Give it to them. Just as one step alone, even if you don't apply it, the next 2 is more than most other people use. The second one is you've got to sell the emotional benefit. You know, people get their energy and they do things by what is important to them. So if you build rapport with somebody and you find some common ground and you understand what is important to them, then it's relatively simple to find the emotional benefit that would trigger, they know what's important to them, so it triggers a decision. So you deliver emotional benefit. So you start off with acknowledgement, recognition, and then you bring in the emotional benefit of what it is that you're trying to persuade them to do or think. And the last step of this formula is simply social proof. You know, show the proof. If you can include some logic and some reasoning, that's even better. But social proof of, it's happened before, and why, logically, it just makes sense. So that is the 3-step simple formula of everything we've spoken about. Acknowledge somebody's reality first. Deliver the emotional benefit. Show them some social proof. If you can just remember those 3 things alone, that will give you the power to influence and persuade like you have never had before. And yet it's so simple. Really, really simple. Don't overcomplicate this. It's just simple. Acknowledge people, show some emotional benefit, show them social proof. We have a look at some case studies now. The first case study we're going to look at is Coca-Cola. They had they bring in all the emotions, by the way. Happiness is the first one. You see, drink Coca-Cola, it's just happiness everywhere, isn't it? But they had a particular campaign called Share a Coke, and they've analysed the marketing behind Share a Coke campaign, and they found it was based on the 6 principles that we spoke about of Cialdini, 6 principles. And it started off with sharing, where you were able to produce their own labels. Share a Coke with a good friend or an old friend, or make a new friend. This actually had social proof behind it as well. Sharing a Coke. It was just fantastic. It was absolutely perfect match for all the 6 principles. We don't have time to go really deep into this. You can search for it. There's lots of information about it, but very, very interesting. And of course, they also use the in celebrity endorsement here as well. A little bit of authority that Taylor Swift got involved, not surprisingly, to add a little bit of celebrity endorsement. So very, very successful campaign. Beautiful example of some of the 6 principles that were involved in there. The second case study is to look at Apple. Now, when Steve Jobs delivered a presentation on stage, and it's unfortunate with his death, he did a brilliant job. He used all the elements of persuasion in his presentations, and it wasn't by accident. If you really study how he did all his presentations, there was a lot of practice behind the scenes and a lot of calculating. Everything was done with a purpose. And when they have a new product launch, they get the crowds Social proof. Look at our product. You know, they build brand loyalty wonderfully. You know, consistency, commitment is all in there. If you go through those 6 elements and compare that to how Apple perform, next time you see an Apple advertisement, just think of some of those 6 principles there, and you'll see one, if not all 6, right in there. It's a beautiful example of the principles. So let's do a recap of the building of persuasion. We said before, decisions are made from emotions. We said some of the natural senses contributed to that, built on a solid foundation, and we're going to use some of those 6 tools. We also said, as complicated as all of that is and how the mechanics of that actually works, you could actually condense it down. And we looked at the 3-step shortcut formula. Acknowledge somebody's reality. Deliver them the emotional benefit. How is it going to affect them? What is important to them? How could you attach that to an emotion that would get them excited to do what it is that you're putting forward? And then, of course, the social proof, and include some logic argument in there, logic reasoning in there. So look, I know this webinar went deep and it covered a lot of very intricacies, but I'm glad we finished on a very simple note of just acknowledgement, emotional benefit, social proof. Just those 3 things alone will help you. And if you can't even remember those 3, use acknowledgement. You know, even in the home or even in the workplace. You know, I saw a great example just the other day. A particular director wanted a colleague to help them for about 3 minutes. Now, what would we do? Walk over to the colleague's desk. Hey, friend, can you help us for 3 minutes? Or something like that. That's what you'd use, wouldn't you? This director, who is very, very clever and understands persuasion, tried a different approach. Went home and said, "Hi, Bob. Look, I appreciate the work you've done, and I can acknowledge the fact that you've got a huge workload on right now. But I was just wondering, could you just help me for 3 minutes, please? You might even learn something new." And it was amazing the response we got. Instead of just going and asking this person to help them, they went straight away, acknowledged the work that they were doing first, appreciated the workload and the quality of the work, and then delivered an emotional benefit overlaid on that. It was so beautifully done. So thank you very much for staying with me, and just keep it simple. That's all I ask, just keep it simple. If you've enjoyed this information, you'll find a lot more in my book, which is available at successleavesatrail.com. Or if you want to connect with me, just go to the davidbunney.com website.
Hi, my name is Jerry Robert, and I'm the publisher of this phenomenal book at Black Card Books. Success Leaves a Trail. Fast track your success in 3 simple steps. Have you ever read some books where it's so complicated and there's so many parts to it that it's almost impossible to put into practice? You will not have that problem, if you get David's book. We're so proud of him. We're so excited about this book. We know it's destined for international bestsellerhood, if there is such a word. Listen to what he says here. Fast track your success in 3 simple steps. In this book, you're going to discover how to gain clarity, direction, and balance in life, enjoying more energy and fun. Who doesn't want more of that? Break through the mindset obstacles that are holding you back. Develop the skills highly successful people use to be effective. Find low-cost, work-from-home opportunities that give you fast returns. Apply proven techniques for matching opportunity with purpose. I could just go on. David is a person who has done it himself. He's known as the lifestyle mentor. If you want to take your life to the next level, you have got to get this book. And if you have the opportunity to hire David to speak at your company, or you have the opportunity to listen to him at one of his very popular workshops from around the world, get to one of those lectures, man. I mean, he is an up-and-coming, highly successful thought leader. the thing that I like about him is that he's so practical. He's so funny. He's so simple, but not it's not complex. But his stuff works. I am wanting to congratulate him and also encourage you. Pick up a copy for yourself. Pick up a copy from somebody else who you know wants to have more, do more, and be more. You'll be glad you did.
So thank you, Jerry, for that endorsement. What a legend in the industry. I thank you, the listeners, for staying with me for so long. I really appreciate that. And Train Smart Australia for having me every month. What a privilege it is to be associated with such a great company. So again, I thank you very much for your time, and just keep things really simple and just use the word appreciate a lot more, and you'll get a lot more persuasion, I'm sure. Thank you again.